Welcome to the second season of Punching Cards. In these episodes, different teams of master's students who took part in a science communication course sat with experts and explored the latest insights in intelligence research.
By the Science of Intelligence Cluster in Berlin, this is Punching Cards, the podcast about all things intelligent.
Hi there, we are
Irene, Senatore.
Sofya Evdokimova.
Rafael Miranda,
Naomi, Araiwa,
Luise, Mehner,
Enea, Gurra.
broadcasting from the Excellence Cluster Science of Intelligence in Berlin. In this episode, we are going to talk about a fascinating topic with two exceptional guests.
I'm Asifa Majid. I'm Professor of Cognitive Science at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of St. Hugh's College.
I'm Rasha Abdel Rahman. I'm a psychologist specialized in neurocognitive psychology.
Cognitive science is a broad research field at the intersection of philosophy, biology, psychology, AI, linguistics, and even more, looking into how humans perceive, think, and act in the world. One example is the study of languages.
I investigate the role that culture and language plays in shaping the mind.
Content-wise, we are working on language a lot, language production, language comprehension. So how do we speak, how do we understand others, and how do we communicate our own ideas, and on perception and access to visual consciousness.
The field has so far been focused on understanding how a very small group smells, sees, explores, thinks, and speaks. These are the so-called weird people, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. From this very small group, psychology has ever since been making inferences about what it means to experience the world as a human being. Moreover, it has generally been assumed that the contextual and environmental circumstances play a negligible role in shaping human cognitive life. Think about that. It's like assuming that a population living near the North Pole has the same idea of cold and warm as somebody living near the equator. That is pretty weird, don't you think?
There are many pitfalls, but I think one of the things that has not received adequate attention is how we sample cultures so that we can make strong conclusions about universals. So sometimes you find studies where people have compared, for example, English and German and found similar effects in both communities and then concluded something's universal. To me, that's not a very convincing piece of data. It would be more convincing if you had only resources to study two communities, if those were as different as possible on as many dimensions as possible.
Both our guests are very much enthusiastic about investigating the nuanced ways in which human intelligence can be expressed in different environments and in different contexts.
So I think we need to be more serious about how we sample communities and also be more careful about the inferences that we make from the data that we have.
So, how can we fairly investigate what makes us surprisingly similar and what makes us wonderfully diverse? And what can we learn from it? Let's start digging into the topic by asking, why study human language and perception in the first place?
So I grew up bilingual in Glasgow in Scotland, and I had Punjabi as a home language and English as the outside language. And I had this experience of there being some things that were impossible to say in the other language. You know, things that didn't really translate. You could try and paraphrase, but it didn't quite work. So I was already fully bilingual as a young child. So I think I already knew that there were these like different worlds linguistically and culturally, and they needed navigating. And then when I went to study at university, nobody seemed to really care about that at that time. But I was interested in language and philosophy. I studied psychology as my main degree. And then I came across two things around the same time. So one was a book by Anna Wierzbicka, who's a linguist who was studying word meanings in different languages. And this kind of blew my mind. I didn't know that somebody actually studied this. And the second was an annual report from the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. And in it, there was a department that studied languages across the world, undescribed languages. They were doing documentation. And I was just so excited. I wanted to work there.
We think we perceive the world as it is, but in reality, we can already acknowledge from our lived experiences that these processes are much more subjective and they vary across cultures.
We seem to construct our world more than just being passively around and just have a passive kind of idea of the world and perception. It's a very constructive and I think creative process. And I think there's ways to even make this process maybe a little bit more positive. Like I've talked a lot with people actually from the theater and who also do music, and with them we kind of developed an idea that, you know, if perception is so influenced by our assumptions, by cognition in general, we might as well make the world a little bit more positive and better. That's just an anecdote, but yeah.
All this sounds great and extremely promising. A researcher who wants to seriously deal with the complexity of human cognition has to face daunting but exciting challenges. A core challenge consists in integrating areas of research that are still perceived as different by the academic community.
So, you know, sometimes when I apply for a grant in perception, the reviewers write, why is she applying for that? She's a language researcher. And I'm like, yes, but not only. And that is really something, this is also categorical perception in a way, so that, you know, there are research fields and some of them have more or less, they're just isolated. And I think this is challenging. One thing is that people, you know, think, yeah, you're this and that, and then you're less known in other fields. And it's also difficult because there's not so much in integrated research that you could build research on. So that makes it a little bit challenging, but also, from my perspective, extremely interesting.
Even more complex to tackle is the pervasive issue of sample bias. So obvious and yet so ignored in the vast majority of psychological studies.
So you'll read many studies where the researcher will say, we studied 20 participants took part in this study, but they don't tell you who those participants were, how they were recruited. They might give you an age range, but they're not entirely open about the demographics of their participants. I think, sometimes I have read studies published, for example, by colleagues in Sweden, where it's not clear to me after reading the paper whether that study was run in Sweden in Swedish, or was the data collected through one of their collaborators in the States, or was it online? So many of the details are not explicit.
Asifa Majid has insisted on taking the issue of sample variety seriously and developed her experimental designs accordingly.
Rather than making these generic statements that make it seem as if the results apply to all humans, maybe having a limitation section that say, okay, this study suggests X for this group. You know, here are the reasons to think it might be universal, but it may not be, and what kind of sample would we need? So just acknowledging the limitations or the constraints on the inferences that can be made. That would change the game, because right now that's all hidden under the carpet and we act as if our findings are generalizable.
Doing cross-cultural research also entails further challenges related to the legacy of colonial practices. However, Asifa's research could help overcome this very issue by fostering the appreciation of cognitive variety due to the diversity of environments humans can thrive in.
If you take, for example, a cultural evolutionary perspective that starts to think about differences in a way that isn't relying on some idea of a racial hierarchy. Instead, you can start thinking about organism adaptation. Instead of thinking of man, for example, at the top of some sort of species hierarchy, where chimpanzees are perhaps a lower form, and then other animals are even lower, and perhaps crabs are the least. So thinking about hierarchy, instead you can think about how is each organism adapted to its local niche. I mean, isn't it brilliant that a whale can function underwater with the song sequences that they have, live as long as they do, and are resilient under the kinds of threats that we seem to be now posing to them. So you can start thinking about how do different linguistic and cultural groups adapt to very different pressures, if you like, or have different affordances to them. So one kind of interesting thing that's emerged over the last few years is that small scale communities where the speaker community is very small turn out to be grammatically some of the most complex languages that we see. Whereas speaker languages with many speakers, so like English or German where you have millions of speakers, those tend to be grammatically simpler than small scale communities. And so the question is, well, why would that happen? What is it that enables that kind of complexity to emerge, and what stops it from happening in large scale communities? What are the learning pressures? What are the transmission pressures? So we can start thinking about those kinds of questions, and I think it really moves away from those old tropes. It isn't a question if one group is better or worse than the other, because it's thinking about what are the kinds of differences that we see and what are the mechanistic explanations for thinking about how those differences might emerge.
We can learn a great deal on human intelligence and their nuances from this kind of inclusive and cross-disciplinary research. Rasha, for example, has investigated how language shapes visual perception.
For instance, color perception and the distinction between different colors depends on our native language and on the categories of our native language. So there's now quite many studies that show that colors can be distinguished more or less good depending on whether the native language distinguishes between these colors. And that's not 100% arbitrary, but there's definitely clear differences between languages. So in a way it is a little bit arbitrary. Like for instance in German or in English we have just one word, one label for blue, and then you can say it's light blue or it's dark blue, but it's always blue, and there's no way to refer to different shades of blue with different labels. And that is different for instance in Russian or in Greek, where you have different words for light blue and dark blue. And we have also shown, that was Martin Meyer in his dissertation, he has shown that this even has an influence on visual consciousness. So light and dark blue in a paradigm where stimuli are very difficult to detect and often are undetected, they have a higher chance to be perceived by Greek or Russian participants because they make this distinction in their language than German participants who don't.
Humans are also different in their olfactory skills. Contrary to the Western-centered view that has been held true for decades, Asifa has intensely investigated this topic cross-culturally, yielding surprising, insightful, and somewhat funny conclusions. Who could have suspected that the Dutch people have such bad smelling skills?
So the study that I showed had Jahai and Dutch participants smelling different odors.
Nevertheless, certain odors seem to be consistently disgusting across humans.
And that was evident in their facial expressions. That, I think, is evidence that there's shared experience of odors.
Maps is another interesting example. Although it seems to be one of the most obvious candidates for a universal language, we are always quantifying stuff after all. But even then, we observe flourishing variety, which is sadly also often forgotten.
Naturally occurring languages don't all seem to number words like English has. So famously, Paraha only has 1, 2, and many, possibly. There's other languages of the Amazon that have been shown to be similar. And Andrea Bender has done a really nice survey of many of the documented languages of the world and their number system, and shown that they can have many different properties. So for example, some communities have number systems, but different numbers for counting different sorts of things. So one set of words for counting shells, another set of words for counting canoes, for example. So that suggests some properties of what we know to be abstract number systems like English has, so that you are able to enumerate sets of different sizes, that there's a counting sequence that can go from 1 to infinity. Sometimes the numbers actually stop at certain times. So I have a colleague right now who is working on an Amazonian language where there seems to be numbers from 1 till 20 and then it stops. It seems to be perhaps anchored on the body, so counting fingers and toes. But then beyond that, people say, that's it, you can't go. Well, maybe I could use my neighbour's fingers and toes. So there seems to be some boundedness. Now, given that, if you're a speaker of a language like that, it's going to be difficult to then scale up to do the kind of maths that we do in a classroom context, for example, that we rely on to make the buildings that we do now or to develop airplanes.
At the end of our journey, we are left with more variation than uniformity amongst human cognitive strategies and skills. Rather than having a single formal and neutral definition of intelligence, we have a multiform definition of intelligence, where some agents can use their smell in a more fine-grained way, and others can perceive shades of blue which are unimaginable for an English speaker. Asifa doesn't seem to have much of a problem with this conclusion.
Like, if you think about it, blind people are able to use echolocation in order to spatially navigate. Like, isn't that cool? Isn't that intelligence? And what does that tell us about mental capacity? So the potentiality of how we are able to be in the world is intelligence.
So, are we more the same or more diverse? Both Rasha and Asifa gave the same answer to this question.
That's not the right question to ask. We have a shared humanity. But we should admire each other's uniqueness.
Same and different. Same and different.
We hope that you learned something today, and we thank you for listening. This episode was produced by
Enea Gurra.
Luise Mehner. Naomi Araiwa.
Rafael Miranda.
Sofya Evdokimova.
Irene Senatore. You can find and follow our podcast on Spotify and Apple Music and all your favorite podcast platforms. For show notes, links to additional material, more information, and to contact us, visit www.scienceofintelligence.de/punchingcards.